Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we have another panel discussion for yesterday. We were in Normandy, but today we're somewhere else. 80 years ago, the Warsaw Uprising was entering its 8th day. To talk about it, I have three guests from Poland. The first is World War II TV regular, Alina Nowobilska, who will introduce her colleagues. I'll bring her in now. Well, I'll bring them all in now. Good evening, everybody. How are you, Alina?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm really excited. I'm really interested in what's going to happen today on the panel.
Good. So, Alina, introduce your colleagues.
Right, so we have Alexandra Duda, who's above me, really, wearing blue and gorgeous as always. And then to my, I don't know if left or right, I don't know which way we're looking at this side.
To your right, yes.
To my right, we have Marcin Kaczorowski. And, let's get this off. Woody, you're leading this, so...
So I'm going to start with a simple one, really, although it may not be as simple as I think it is, because when I was searching for images to put this together, Google confuses the Ghetto Uprising of 1943 with the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. It kind of images come back and things come back from both events as if they're the same. And so, Alina, do you want to start us off about the fact that they're not the same? And just for those who don't know, explain the differences and then bring your two colleagues in.
So I got pulled into Polish TV around the Warsaw Uprising. I got a phone call. I was like, right, listen, you guys, can you come and talk to us about the differences between the Warsaw Ghetto and the Ghetto Uprising? I was like, what? Are you pulling my leg here? Because there is a massive difference. First of all, is that the Poles had a choice in their uprising, and in the ghetto, they were literally, I'm not that they're saying that neither fought for their lives, but they faced direct extermination. So it was either they were going to fight in the ghetto, or they were going to end up in Treblinka exterminated. And they wanted to stand their ground. That's probably the biggest distinction we can say between the Ghetto Uprising and the Warsaw Uprising. The next difference, time. The other difference is that, for example, looking at a geographical scale. So the Ghetto Uprising, perfectly, fantastic, thank you. Maps, excellent, love a good map. So you can see the Warsaw Ghetto is enclosed in a specific geographical area. This is the only place where the Ghetto, I don't know why I'm pointing, you can't see me point at the map, but you can more or less see how concentrated the ghetto is. Now, the Warsaw Uprising took part not just in the city. I don't know if people can notice behind me, funnily enough, we actually have a map of Warsaw from 1939, 1945. So there's a map there, and it happened, well, there we go, next map, perfect. You can see it's on a much wider scale, but not only is the Warsaw Uprising taking place in the city, as you can see, all the the red areas and the yellow areas and whatnot, it's also taking part in the forest. So, for example, in the Campinos forest, in the northern west part of Warsaw. I still get confused with north, south, east and west. I'm an adult, I should know these things. And you've got partisans fighting in this forest. So the ghetto in itself, smallly concentrated. Anyway, I've talked enough. I'm going to let my colleagues talk now.
So, Alexandra.
I would like to concentrate on the statistics, because we need to stress that in the Warsaw Uprising that took place in August and September 1944, around 50,000 Polish insurgents fought to liberate their country, to liberate Poland. When it comes to Jews who fought actively for their lives, these numbers are much smaller. We need to remember that at the start of the Ghetto Uprising in April 1943, there were about 55,000 Jews inside the ghetto. And when it comes to the soldiers who took up the arms, there were two organizations, Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, which translates into Jewish Fighting Organization, and Żydowski Związek Wojskowy, the Jewish Military Union. The first one had between 200 and 400 soldiers. When it comes to the second one, between 150 up to 260 soldiers. So in total, we may speak about 600 soldiers who fought to liberate the Warsaw Ghetto to be free. Of course, they were destined to slaughter because the conditions were so difficult at that time in Warsaw. So we need to know the numbers. Of course, we all know that as well Jews as Poles in 1944 were very courageous, and they wanted to fight for the dignity Yes, and the whole confusion when it comes to this distinction between the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and Warsaw Rising of 1944 comes from the fact that Poland was behind the Iron Curtain for so many years. After the end of World War II, only the books about the Ghetto Uprising, about the Shoah, about the Holocaust were so popular in the West. So here comes the confusion. Many times where we work at the Warsaw Uprising Museum, we have guests who come and they are convinced that they have come to the museum that is dedicated to the Ghetto Uprising, and they are shocked that they came to the museum that tells the story of the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. Maybe now Marcin could add something to...
Exactly. Yes, to better understand the context of those two uprisings, we have to look at some background information. And well, I'd say, well, whether it was Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was a struggle to save the Jewish lives. Actually, I'd say most of those fighters knew that they were about to die. So I would reframe it to, I would put it like this: they were actually fighting for death with dignity. It was absolutely clear that after the Great Deportation of 1942, and Germans sent 300,000 people to the Treblinka death camp, the ghetto was about to be liquidated, and there will be no one left alive. If we speak about Warsaw Uprising, it's one of the three largest urban battles. So for our American audience, I think it's good to remember that American soldiers actually never fought a battle like this in the city during World War II. The Battle of Cologne, the liberation by the armored unit, that's it cannot be compared with Warsaw Uprising. It's German losses reaching, I would say, the upper estimate up to 26,000 soldiers, up to 10,000 dead, 9,000 wounded, 6,000 missing. The Heinrich Himmler himself said that this is the hardest struggle since the beginning of the war. Close quarters combat, house to house, street to street, for lasting for 2 months. The forces the Germans deployed reached jointly about 50,000 troops. Warsaw Uprising is definitely the largest battle fought by the resistance units throughout occupied Europe. As we know, there were other uprisings in different cities in Czechoslovakia and of course in Paris. We may speak about huge battles in former Yugoslavia, fought by the very brave Yugoslav resistance, and very effective too. But in terms of urban battles, Warsaw is probably top 3. Of course, what connects both uprisings is the people and the organizations, because Warsaw Ghetto fighters also received support from the Home Army. The Ghetto Wall was indeed attacked by the Warsaw Resistance, by the Polish Resistance, by the Home Army, that also delivered some weapons. The left-wing Jewish combat organization, fighting organization, had their own, had mostly, I'd say, supplies from Home Army, while the Zionistic wing, the Zionist fraction, had also their own connections due to the fact that many of them were Polish officers in the Polish army. Of course, Polish Jews were Polish citizens before the war, and there were more than 3 million of them, and many of them served in the Polish army in 1939. So the Home Army, I would say, is the common element here for both those uprisings. Plus 1943. Why was there no chance to liberate Warsaw at the time? It's not only because it's a few hundred Jewish fighters that rose against Germans, but it's because the front was too far. Yes, the Americans were too far, Russians were too far. It was impossible to liberate Warsaw. So to answer the question that why did not Poles rise together with the Jews in 1943, simply because it was impossible to liberate Warsaw at all. The front had to be closer, full stop.
That's a very good point. I want to bring Alina in now, and I think what you said there about the Ghetto Uprising really being a statement of the Jews there dying on their own terms. They're almost certainly going to die, but let's die where we want to. We name the place of our own death, in a sense, where rather than allowing someone else to take you away to be killed on their schedule. And as you said, I'm very glad you made the point about how far away the front was in 1943, because that element of just how close the Soviets were in real terms in 44 is a big part of the story. But Lena, you wanted to add something to this little bit of discussion.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm a historian that's got both feet in both camps. So grew up in England. I mean, most of the people here that are watching this should know this by now, so I don't know why I'm repeating myself. But grew up in England, spend most of my time in Poland, work on Polish history. And it's really interesting because I always get asked the one question. I think I might have used this one already on your show before, Woody, but we're going to do it again. I don't care. Is that when people ask me, why are you so interested in the Warsaw Uprising? Well, my grandfather fought in the Warsaw Uprising, and great grandmother died in the Warsaw Uprising. So the one thing that really gets me drawn into it. And the first question I get asked to, and this is, by the way, also by historians. So this is what makes it even more depressing. And the first question they ask is, am I Jewish?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I'm offended by the lack of knowledge, not by obviously being asked if I'm Jewish. I'm offended by the lack of knowledge that people do. The same thing when it comes down to things like Auschwitz as well, because people don't seem in the West to understand that there is a big distinction. So when I do write about things about the Warsaw Uprising, I try to put in 1944, or if I forget to put in 1944, then people will usually comment on one of my tweets and say, oh, brave ghetto fighters. I'm like... And I try to distinguish the two. And then I also do mention, because it is very important to mention, that Jews did fight in the Warsaw Uprising.
Yeah.
So we can't eliminate that aspect either. And I really underline this in the podcast as well, that they did rise up. Okay, there's slightly different elements to all of this. We don't have time to go through all of this, but they did fight, and they were just as brave. They had a common enemy to fight at the end of the day.
Who knows, maybe more than in Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because the upper estimate was up to 3,000. But we'll never know, because they would never declare their nationality. Why would they do that? Yes, it's
they were scared.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean there would be just first of all, there were no Jewish units as such, and frequently Jews were mixed with not only Polish socialists, but I think it's a great example of how Jews and Poles cooperated. Chrobry 2 is a famous battalion in which there were mostly Polish nationalists, a lot of Polish socialists, and probably the highest number of Polish Warsaw Jews. And even the second in the chain of command was Jewish. So later after the war, they were asked, why would you fight on the barricades with those chauvinists? And they just said, because these were the very decent people. Because it was about loyalty and respect, not whether someone liked each other or not, or about what happened before the war. All those conflicts were put aside.
There was also a Jewish platoon, sorry to cut you off there, I'm going to jump in there, who fought in the Polish People's Army, who was headed by Zuckerman. And he put out a call, I think it's on the second or the third day of the Warsaw Uprising. He puts out a call to say, for all of you who are Jewish, who fought in the Ghetto Uprising, who are part of this resistance movement, come and join us. And that obviously complicated a little thing, because they couldn't necessarily join the Home Army, as you just said. You kind of explained it all there. And then they ended up joining the Polish People's Army up in the Old Town, and they were the only exclusive Jewish platoon that fought in the uprising. But as you said, they were also intermingled within the insurgents, and they also took upon Polish names that they were using during the occupation. So like you said, we will never know exactly how many people fought in the uprising, because they were intermingled within Poles, and they died as Poles, and they were buried as Poles under crosses, and we just won't know.
So we've already touched on misunderstandings and myths, and that's going to be our next subject for discussion. And we'll touch as we progress whether the myths are universal, i.e. do people within Poland have the same misunderstandings about the situation as, for example, people from Britain or America, or is there a difference with people's knowledge? But let's move it towards other myths. So we've understood that the Ghetto Uprising and the Warsaw Uprising separate, but they have a connection too. So myths generally that won't go away. Alexandra, we'll start with you.
Well, lots of people keep saying that kids were fighting in the Warsaw Uprising. And of course, we need to state that there were lots of miners, lots of teenagers who helped at the barricades at the back of the front. They were distributing newspapers, they were delivering letters, they were very, very active. They wanted to do something. There were lots of those who were only 12, 13, 14. Of course, these were older kids. Yes, they were teenagers, but they did not take part in active fighting at the barricades. There were some instances where kids would throw Molotov cocktails, hand grenades against the German tanks. And there is this very famous case of a 10-year-old Jerzy Schulz, codename Tigris, Tiger, because he attacked with hand grenades a German Tiger tank. Yes, so later he was imprisoned in Lambsdorff POW camp. So imagine for a 10-year-old boy being imprisoned among the older ones, that must be awful experience, yes, when it comes to suffering, not only during the Warsaw Rising, being deprived of normal life, but later being imprisoned in very harsh conditions in a German POW camp. So we have this a very well-known statue dedicated to little insurgent in the old town of Warsaw. So lots of foreigners who come to Warsaw tend to have this image that lots of kids participated in the rising and they actively fought in the battle. Of course, we need to clarify what the battle was about, yes. And right now also there's this tendency to say that the Warsaw insurgents were not only those who actively fought in the rising, but many other people who participated in the rising who were in August and September in Warsaw. So, so that's a major change in the current attitude to treat the history of the Warsaw Uprising.
Thank you. So children. So Marcin, what myths and things do you encounter that you wish would go away, or do you try and combat?
I think thank you, Alexander, for pointing out the myths concerning Warsaw Uprising. I think the myths that I come across most often, they concern World War II in Poland overall, and
right.
Not specifically Warsaw Uprising. The reason for which is Warsaw Uprising is simply forgotten in the that's my impression most of the time in the West, and not only in the West, also in other countries. So that this whole story concerns. So be it Israel, I think Germany, Great Britain too. I think in Great Britain the knowledge is a little bit more extensive due to the airdrops and the sacrifice of the British airmen. So I think, and of course, because many Warsaw insurgents later lived in England or in Scotland. But I'd say most of the myths concern World War II and especially the September campaign. So not really the Warsaw Uprising. The most recurrent myth that the visitors from abroad keep asking the question whether Poles really charged using cavalry against tanks. This is really frustrating. It's really terrible because, of course, it's a product of Nazi propaganda, and the Germans would bring the Italian journalists that would later widespread the situation, of course, to show Poles as idiots and a primitive nation that doesn't even know armor. And it keeps coming back. The other aspect is, thank you for mentioning this, Alina, of course, what happened to Poles after the uprising. So we have to remember that how many people end up in concentration camps.
Yeah.
And the lack of knowledge about who Auschwitz was set up for is terrifying. It's I think well, my organization, the Memory of Nations Foundation, also participates in a committee that tries to commemorate the first transport to Auschwitz, namely the 14th of June 1940, 728 Poles. That was the first large transport of prisoners to Auschwitz. It's a completely unknown story. I think perhaps in the recent years only, some major portals and newspapers like New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian at times started mentioning that Auschwitz was actually set up as a camp for Poles at the beginning, and later it was kind of extended. It was transformed into a death camp by building the second camp, Birkenau, for the Jews. And many Warsaw insurgents and also civilians end up in not only in Auschwitz, but also in Birkenau. There were 4 transports to Birkenau. The first one was on the 12th of August. They were not exterminated. There's like many of the children starved, many people died. But when we think about the fate of especially the most terrifying was the fate of the female fighters who ended up in Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück were, by the way, if you visit the camp, it's so difficult to find any information about who was actually at the camp, and the Polish women are overwhelming majority of the victims of the camp in terms of how many died. I believe out of 27,000 dead, 26,000 were Polish women, also victims of medical experiments, gas chamber, Vernichtung durch Arbeit, as Germans called it, so destruction through work. And many of them were not only Warsaw insurgents, but actually suspects. So whoever was, it was enough to be a suspect. If Germans suspected that you even supported the home army, you can end up at Ravensbrück camp. So the fate of many civilians was actually much worse than the prisoners of war, who were treated quite well in comparison with those who ended up in concentration camps. As I mentioned, up to 70,000 Warsaw Warsaw civilians end up on the concentration camps, and the survival rate of Ravensbrück 30%. Mauthausen, Gusen, the last transports, 10% survival rate. Auschwitz 50%. Basically, the smaller the camp, the lower the chances of survival.
Right. So, Alina, we'll bring you in on myths, and I think then we'll move on to significant moments, because and Alina, particularly, you're doing a lot of work in the UK as well, and and globally. Is there a particular one myth that annoys you, or is it several? In your case, it's going to be several, isn't it?
It is. I'm going to be really short and sweet, I promise. So, first of all, Daniel, love my coffee cup too. Yes, I am watching the chat, by the way. So, thank you for that. Love my cup. Anyway. Moving on to that. So first of all, Marcin just mentioned Auschwitz and things. In the next 2-3 days on my podcast, we will be talking about that a little bit more in more detail. So listen out for that one. I think it's on day 11, day 12. The first deportation is to Auschwitz. Anyway, for me, very, very short and sweet statistics are a big issue for me. Right now, apparently, according to Twitter, or X, however you want to call it, we have a new statistic of 250,000 people died in the Warsaw Uprising, which is total rubbish. I was going to use a swear word there, but I'm not going to. It's completely not a rubbish. I know Ola's going to disagree with me on this, probably Marcin too, but I went roundabout work on the statistic between 150 to 180,000. And the statistic and the research is still being done on the Warsaw Uprising. And we can't really be 100% sure because there are so many factors that are involved in this. So, for example, bodies were burnt. You had the ashes were being weighed. They weren't actually being weighed correctly, for example. And that also regards to the atrocities in the Wola massacre. So head to my podcast, you'll know more on the 5th. Funny enough, Ola is actually one of the voices in that. Right. She's absolutely fantastic. But yes, so that statistic is one of my biggest issues. Secondly, I think this actually relates a little bit to what's happening. I know we weren't going to talk about it, but for example, what's happening in Ukraine is it's all about fighting, meaning everybody's constantly engaged on the front line, shooting, explosions, bombing, constantly. There is no normal life. That is all it's all about. That's really not true, because you had things that happened like weddings. Ola and I, one of our favorite things to talk about are the weddings that happened during the Warsaw Uprising. Absolutely incredible footage we have of probably Bolesław Biega and Alicja Biega, one of the best things by Rokossovsky. We will talk more on my podcast about all of this. What else have we got? Puppet shows, for example. Puppet shows were happening for the children. There were masses that were going on. There were soup kitchens that were open. People were eating together. People were trying to function every day like normal during the Warsaw Uprising. It wasn't constantly like the images we see, for example, in the Old Town, where everybody's hidden in the rubble and it's constant bombings. In other parts of the city, it was a little quieter. It was that opportunity for people to be able to meet, to be able to have a cup of coffee. There's a great photograph, I think I must have posted it on Twitter somewhere, my grandfather with the rest of the insurgents having a break and drinking coffee. You know, normal life went on. love happened. This is another thing I love talking about during the Warsaw Uprising. People fell in love, as we know, as a result of marriages, for example. Children were being born. Maybe sex not so often because everybody's filthy and dirty and nobody wants to be having sex with someone they haven't washed for weeks upon end. But that, yeah, for me, that's probably one of the most important things. Life went on, and the same is happening in Ukraine when you see things in the newspaper going, well, why are these people going to bathe in the River Wisła? There's film footage of Warsaw Uprising insurgents jumping into I think is it the River Ola or like...
No, it's in the city centre. There was a special reservoir.
Yeah, you've got naked insurgents jumping into this giant reservoir and they're having fun. Life went on. There we go.
Thank you. But we're not, of course, diminishing the death that did happen, but just saying there's different things going on. So let's kind of move to significant events. And when I wrote this down, I think I didn't decide I was going to break it into two parts, because I'm going to ask you first what you think was the most significant event at the time. So in 1944, was there a particular moment in the uprising that you think was significant? And it could be significant for positive or negative reasons. And then, now that we're 80 years on, is there something significant about it in terms of how the world should be looking at it? So we'll do the round of significant events at the time first. So let's start with Alexandra first. So at the time in 1944, is there a particular moment that you think is the most important?
Well, there are so many of them, but I believe that one is hugely underrated. I'm specializing in the Warsaw Airlift, known also as the Warsaw Concerto. I don't know, how do you pronounce that in English? So the airdrops and the air missions that were operated from Brindisi, southern Italy, to Warsaw by the British, South African, Polish squadrons. And we very often forget that that was the only time when the Allied airmen fell for the freedom of Poland, because they sacrificed their lives and there were so many casualties. And I'll just give you one example, because I learned quite recently that at some point during the Warsaw Uprising, there were so many losses when it comes to those air crews that the commanders said, no, you cannot fly anymore, only volunteers may continue. And there was a Major Odendahl from the South African Air Force who stepped up and say, I cannot leave my Polish friends alone, and I will keep on flying. So that moves me a lot, yes. And whenever I read the stories about those dedicated airmen who had nothing to do with Poland, and at first when they heard you are to fly to Poland, they ask, where's Poland? Yes, why are we destined for death? Because it's so dangerous, and Russians are just on the other side of the Vistula River. So why do we have to fly so far away if Russians are only 500 meters from the theater of the Warsaw Rising? They understood the situation once they were flying by the city of Warsaw that was in flames, and they dropped those vital supplies. So I believe that historians in Poland and historians abroad tend to forget that that was a very important moment, because Poland unfortunately did not receive any substantial help from the side of the Allies during World War II, but these brave airmen that came from Britain, that came from South Africa and many other countries, did so much to bring a light of hope to people at the time of the Atmos trial.
And thank you for that. And it also brings up the potential rabbit hole of just how complicated that subject of the airdrops is, because we had a question earlier, what was the Polish reaction to the lack of airdrops from allies? Because obviously there was some, but there could have been more. And we have the Soviets getting involved as well. So that's one of those areas that can be looked at from two different points of view, depending on your point of view. It can be looked at, as you just said there, what a great sacrifice these Allied air crew did getting the supplies they did there. But on a wider, bigger level, there should have been more. And maybe we're like we are with me in France, is the Allies dropped supplies to the French in war, but not the artillery they needed. They only dropped them, the basic small infantry. So that's another subject for later on. But we'll move on. Alina, what's your significant moment?
Funny
You're
enough,
allowed to say granddad if you want. That's
I'm
okay.
gonna rant, but I'm also
Okay.
gonna work off something Ola said, because it is a significant moment, but it's also a moment I love ripping the piss out of. And that is talking about Allied airdrops. The Soviet airdrops is a
Yeah.
very important moment in the Warsaw Uprising. It's a pointless, useless, and most ridiculous act of Stalin to say, "Hi, everyone. You know, you've kind of been bugging us Soviets to do something about the uprising, even though we've been sitting on the other side of the river and kind of watching Warsaw burn. We're gonna send you some supplies." And they do. And it takes them, God, my mathematics is awful, but it's on the 13th of September. So that's 50 something odd days. If anybody can work that mathematically, just chuck it in the chat and that'll be even better for me. So 50 something days into the Warsaw Uprising, right? The Allies start preparing to drop on the 4th of August, right? Can we see the difference in the timescale? It's absolutely ridiculous. Not only that, these airdrops, most of them don't have parachutes, first of all. So you're dropping canisters of weapons, food, medical equipment out of a plane of, I can't remember how many feet up it is, but Ola will probably remember better than I will.
50 meters.
There you go, 50 meters above, and they're dropping to the ground, breaking open, everything inside is breaking. Some of them even filled with sand, so they force them to break even more. You've got, sorry, it's a very big pet peeve of mine that this is what the Soviets are doing. It's useless, it's pointless. And the whole point of this is to say, look, we helped. Not our fault that everything got broken on the inside. So these soldiers can't use anything. They can't use anything to help them, even though this lovely, kind gesture, yes, quotation marks, come from Stalin. So that's my answer.
Absolutely. Paul got actually backstabbed by all the allies. So if they, as Churchill put it, God protect us against friends because we can handle our enemies. So I think on the contribution of the Allied airmen, we have to take a look at two aspects. The first of all is military, and absolutely here it was absolute brotherhood between Polish and British airmen, and of course also due to the Polish contribution, the Battle of Britain. Just for those who don't know the story, Poles managed to shoot down about 1/8 of German airplanes in the most decisive moment when the British were running out of pilots. Poles managed to shoot down over 200 German airplanes, massively contributing to winning the battle. Yes, so the British airmen volunteered. All of them were volunteers, South Africans too, and the Americans too in the end. No one made them participate in those missions. The South Africans sometimes recall they didn't sign up for this because they first volunteered and then they were informed what was about to happen, and they were informed just that Churchill planned a mission that will have no military significance, but it will comfort the Poles and make them feel they are not alone. They remember meeting the family. Maybe they are watching now the fantastic and that is also commemorated at Warsaw Rising Museum. Brian Desmond Jones, who recalled the unit in which he flew, lost about up to 50% of the airmen. It was so maybe also Paul to justify the Air Force. I'm not so sure whether practically it would be possible because the losses were comparable to the missions over Germany. They were decimated terribly, especially over Krakow, where there were a lot of night fighter zones they had to fly through, and Soviets, of course, forbade the British and South African and Polish, of course, airmen too, to land in today's Ukraine. That only was possible for the American crews that participated in this one single mission on the 18th of September. So that also shows Roosevelt's attitude to, well, if Truman had been the president of the time, perhaps it would have been completely different, but Roosevelt Poland was just a little token of friendship that he gave to Stalin, was just a symbol of friendship. But it's a fact that at some point 1,000 airmen were flying over, also 1,000 US airmen flew over Warsaw. Alina, you want to say something? Yes.
Yeah, I want to add to this. This is another one of mine that I get really annoyed with. Marcin, stop pressing my buttons. So basically, it was over 1,000 packages, or was it 2,000? I can't remember, my statistics are out the window. And then 200 and something of those managed to fall into insurgent hands. And they do the airdrop by the 20th, 21st of September.
Yes.
By this point, there is no hope for the Warsaw Uprising.
Too little, too late. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
It's so frustrating. They were given permission on the 10th of September to land. Why is it taking them? Okay, somebody's probably going to yell at me this in the comments, but I don't care. Why is it taking them 10 days to basically load up your aeroplane? You should have been out on the 11th. That would it have helped the Warsaw Uprising by the 11th? I don't know. I'd like to say it would have. It would have given the insurgents a better chance. So Americans, sorry to everybody in the comments that's an American and who's listening. I really don't want to offend you, but this was just a shit show.
Yeah,
Well, I
we
think-
would need General Patton as the president of the time, who said we defeated the wrong enemy. Yes, that he would understand that the Cold War was looming out on the horizon, and that's Roosevelt was a dreamer and a cynical dreamer. That's an interesting combination. He was dreaming about defeating colonialism together with Stalin, and he was also cynical because Polish support, only he needed Polish voters, that's it. And he would even photograph himself with the map of pre-war Ukraine indicated to Lvov, so to Lviv, as if saying this is going to come back to Poland. Well, absolutely, well, he knew, because he made the arrangements at the conference in Tehran that Poland will remain under Soviet boot after the war. So Roosevelt played this, well, I don't want to say beautifully, tragically for Poland. So the big three, even more, of course, that's also an unknown part of the unknown side of the Polish story after World War II. If it had been for, if Churchill had his way, Poland wouldn't even get the compensation in the West. Yeah, so the land that is today Polish would remain in Germany, meaning Western Pomerania, Silesia, large parts of Greater Poland. It was actually Stalin who insisted on giving it to Poland, of course, to have a larger buffer for the Soviet Union, right? But it's true that Poland got stabbed from all directions, and this is, I think, the key to understanding why the Warsaw Uprising was forgotten. Why should it be remembered by anyone? Germans don't want to talk about it. Germans don't want to talk about it because this is the largest massacre they committed during World War II. Soviets don't want to talk about it because they betrayed Poles, and they just kind of repetition of 1939 Ribbentrop-Molotov. It looks like as if they had a deal with Germans and they just waited us out to bleed Warsaw out. Americans made one airdrop. And I think the British and the South Africans have the best reasons to talk about it, but not because of the post-war Churchill's policies, which are compromising for him. In our eyes, of course.
We can agree that every one of the countries either let you down or betrayed you on some level of that scale. I mean, it's where we are on that league table. The Soviets possibly being at the top, but yeah, everybody collectively let Poland down, and at multiple times during and after World War II. Which kind of brings me, I think, to why I want to, this second significant moment, because, obviously for the first 40 years after World War II, this story was only being told within the confines of a communist-controlled organization. And then beyond that, you could start telling your story the way you wanted to. But I'm assuming it's slightly more complicated than just those two neat eras there. But let's go around with the significance of the time and how it's significant today. So we'll go around the same order. So Alexandra, what 80 years on, what's the most significant event of the uprising for you?
I love hearing from the tourists who come to Warsaw that they came on purpose to take part in the official commemorations of, let's say, the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising that took place just a few days ago. So it's lovely to see people who want to take part in those commemorations, who want to feel what the patriotism is about. How is it possible for people to love country so much, to sacrifice so much, and it's really amazing that people are pouring into our country to see the significance of tradition, of the values that we wanted to defend in the past, and which are still so important to so many of our countrymen. And these values are God, honor, and homeland. Yes, they are inscribed on our banners. Yes, and for so many centuries, we believe that they are key to our existence. And it's very important to stress that Poland continues to live, although very often in our history we were dispossessed of our state, yes, but as a nation we managed to survive because Polish families were very, very strong, and they passed on the legacy, yes. So Poland is very, very ephemeric when you think about the concept of Polishness, yes, but it steals the heart of people who right now, especially in the West, truly miss what's really significant in life, and those true values that were so important not only for Polish people but also for all those brave warriors in Normandy, yes, and other battlefields during World War II. So it's very important to restore this spirit, this pride in one's country, and I believe you may grasp that whenever you come to Poland. And I'm happy that for example, in the Warsaw Uprising Museum, we present this story and people are totally enchanted by it. Although it's tragic, it's full of traumatic events, but also it gives you the sense that sometimes there are some values worth standing for.
It's very inspiring. And even in the 4 years I've been doing World War II TV, and I covered the Warsaw Uprising, I think it was 4 years, it might have been 3 with Alina. But now in those 4 years, how many more Polish voices are telling the story? And it doesn't mean that we don't want to read what Alexandra Ritchie and Roger Morehouse and other Western authors have said about that, because of course they've contributed to our understanding of it. But it's so gratifying to now see people like yourselves. Okay, Alina's got a foot in each camp there, but telling the story from within. I mean, I'm still struggling to get French voices to talk about the liberation of Paris, but that's another subject to carry on with. But Alina, you know, significant for you 80 years on. I mean, you know, your grandfather clearly is a very influential in your life, and you're now, you know, got this foot in each camp. What's significant about it for you 80 years on?
We're sitting in it. Exactly. This is significant for me. I think it's amazing how many historians are becoming so much more open to be able to talk, and allowing people like myself, Roger Morehouse, and there's so many other historians that know so much about the Warsaw Uprising that are being able to have a voice. Like you said, the three of us sitting here being able to talk to you, and you're being open to allowing us to express our opinions, to talk about our perspectives, to talk about our experiences. So for me, that is probably one of the most important things. I was also given a platform at We Have Ways Fest to be able to talk about Warsaw Uprising. That was incredible. I have a book in the works. It might be about the Warsaw Uprising. I don't know if you noticed
we saw the wink there. Yeah, we saw the wink.
Just you know, so it might be about the Warsaw Uprising, but there's so many different things that people are doing. And anybody in the comments, I know I shouldn't bring this up, but if you fancy yelling at Alan James to maybe start talking more about Polish history, that would also be really great.
Yeah, I mean, we're not doing enough. I mean, I'm trying a little bit, but I mean, I've done two Normandy shows this week, one Polish show. But I'm trying.
Do not put
I'm one person, 1,500 shows in 4 years. But anyway, it's.
But you have done amazing, Woody. You have given me this is so important. Everybody in these comments, please, I would love for you all to give a round of applause to Woody, because he has opened his heart. He has opened World War II TV to allow us to be able to talk. And you allow me to sit here and blabber on about Auschwitz and Polish prisoners and the Warsaw Uprising and all of these things. And you allow so many other historians to be able to come on and talk about their subject. And you open up, and you're probably one of the very, very few people that allow people to do this, because you're so
very
open.
Kind. It's very nice of you. I mean, I do feel I'm also acting as your counselor when you come on and rant. I'm helping unburden yourself of some of your problems. But before we take some of it, there's been lots of questions coming, which I want to get to before we move on to kind of some legacies. But we've got one more. Marcin, your opinion. Where do you think we are? What's important for you 80 years on that we should be talking about? What's significant about this coverage this year, perhaps, for you?
I think things like you're doing now, that's important. Really, it's the conveying the message to the Western audiences is what really matters, because that brings Poland out of the gray area in terms of World War II. It's absolutely crucial to do that because Poland has been this gray area for decades, and it concerns not only the Polish World War II history but overall Polish history. I mean, the especially in Western Europe, the history of the whole continent is so much Franco-centric or Anglo-centric or Germanic-centric, and as if a nation that was amongst in the ranks of the most powerful ones, especially in 16th century, 17th century, and would have contributed massively to political thought, in particular in 18th century, but also in the 15th century. It's like you have to forget, we have to remember Poland was one of the first countries to talk about human rights, about religious freedom, about it's one of the cradles of European democracy. Those things were completely forgotten. So I'd say talking about World War II resistance and different aspects of it, shedding light on them, it's just the beginning, because Poland is to blame too for what happened. I'm not only talking about communism. Recently there were two good B-class movies about the Squadron 303 that defended British skies. And I mean, where the hell were the Polish foundations, Polish government? They should have given those guys $50 million, and they will be capable of shooting it in the skies. Instead, we have two very, very good B-class movies. That was lost opportunity, and it happens all the time in Poland. Poland misses. So that's the thing that hasn't happened yet. What has happened is that we are able to talk about all the fractions, all the political aspects of Warsaw Uprising, and there's not going to be any censorship, which is really important, because that's not so obvious, because the Warsaw Uprising has had so much criticism from the left and from the right too, that it was impossible to discuss all the aspects of it. But the most important things are yet to come, I believe, and I hope another movie like perhaps Roman Polanski's Pianist will be created. I'm talking about this level, this class of a movie, because so far that's one of the very, very few films in the West that actually portrayed occupation and war in Poland. And I'm not sure if Roman Polanski was rewarded by the Hollywood. And I would say rather on the contrary, because he was against the current, against the political current. I would say that in Hollywood, Poles are always portrayed in the most terrible way. So this is yet to happen, but I believe spreading knowledge about wartime in Poland is going to change it. This is one of the contributions, I believe.
And I'm glad that you're in a sense that there's disagreement coming out of Poland about your history, because you're taking control. Because for me, as a British point of view, when I was reading about Polish history back in my youth, it always seemed it was victims. It was always how many were murdered here, how many thousand were killed there, and it was your story was presented as victims. And now you're kind of coming and saying, no, we want to tell our story this way. And sometimes we disagree about how we're going to tell our story, because we've been affected by other countries telling our story. And now we want to tell it our own way. And I think that's really important, that you're coming out and there's not always complete agreement about it, because that's encourages debate, it encourages conversation. But we ought to deal with some questions, because they've been piling up, and some of them are really good. So the first one who wants to answer any of these, we'll do. Some of them are quick, some are more complicated. So Ian Carr asked ages ago, did the geographical area of the ghetto and the uprising overlap? Yes.
Short answer.
Brilliant. We'll leave with that. Willie Robertson asked, was there much training before their uprising? So there's some other questions coming later about how much they knew about the geopolitical situation. But on the moment the Home Army were planning it, announced it, how many people were able to actually go into it with some understanding of small arms and weapons and tactics?
We have to remember there were two types of units, right? Yeah. Professional conspirators and those who joined the uprising in the course of the fighting.
Right.
And sometimes the boys from the hood didn't have much. They had zero training. They just appeared and they just give me a rifle. Sometimes there were soldiers before, but many of them had been training for 5 years or even longer. Yes, in there, and before they were also professional soldiers. So it depends on the kind of a unit, and the insurgents themselves called those units stormtroopers. So the professional fighters, and the ones who were actually in conspiracy, right? So Alina, that's your grandfather's unit, stormtroopers, like Zośka,
Maybe.
Parasol, Żniwiarz, this kind of a unit, and the
Rafałki,
ones who
Kiedyw.
were frequently very brave, and they were quite successful, but they were just like a neighborhood watch that got armed, and like Krybar is a very good example, the ones who took over the power plant, and that was the most important strategic success during Warsaw Uprising. So this is not to say that they were like the second category unit. No, not at all. But they simply didn't have so much time to prepare.
They're also a bit nuts. Sorry, but they were. I mean, my grandfather's a prime example. That's the kind of things that they did was just insane. That we'd sit here today going, "My God, how did you manage to do that?" So.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions about the reaction of Poles around the world to the Warsaw Uprising. So representative ones, and then you can all jump in as. So Ian is asking, what was the reaction to the Warsaw Uprising among Polish troops fighting with the Red Army? And then there was another one. I'll find it later
That's
on.
a good one, actually. Very good question.
So, and Sheldrake asked, we asked yesterday whether the first Polish armored division troops were aware of the uprising, which they were. So that was in Normandy. But how much did the people of Warsaw know about their troops in Normandy and Italy? So a range of questions about what knowledge of the uprising was happening with Poles around the world. So who wants to take that one?
If I may start, because I know a lovely story when it comes to our troops that were in Scotland. So those troops that were engaged in the Battle of Arnhem later on under the Sosabowski's commandment. So when they learned that the Warsaw Uprising started, they desperately wanted to be parachuted into Warsaw. Of course, the British commanders had totally different plans. So when the Polish soldiers learned that they would not go to Warsaw, they went on strike, on hunger strike for a few days. So it's one of the examples, that those Poles who were under the Allied commandment in the West wanted to do something, but not necessarily they would be allowed, because they formed a part of the Allies.
Okay,
those who marched side by side the Red Army, if they went on strike, they would be sent to Gulag the day that happened. But they definitely wanted to help. Those who marched side by side Russians, they were released from Gulag. They had a simple choice: either you march with us in our units controlled by the communists under a Polish banner, though sometimes even with the Polish priests, or you stay in the Gulag and get starved to death. So the choice was very simple. And there were 5 Polish battalions that were deployed actually on the other side of the river. Russians didn't give them much artillery support or airstrike support, so they were doomed from the very beginning. And they participated in the worst fighting. There's the heaviest fighting. That's the Old Town and Czerniaków bridgehead. Hard to say which one was worse, because the Old Town is a hurricane of artillery fire from over 100 cannons, Luftwaffe attacks all the time, and the rocket also dropped on the Old Town, killing 30,000 civilians. And the Czerniaków is fighting in constant. They were constantly surrounded from all directions, and the grenade launchers, snipers, fire surrounding those troops. So they wanted to help, but the Russians used them as a symbol. So we tried to help, but it was too difficult, and so on and so forth. That was used by the communistic propaganda for many years. I mean, what do you want from us? We tried to help, but it was impossible. And actually, the Russian version history that would be broadcast on Russian TV till today, as the. There's a great saying about lies. The best lies are those where 70% is truth, right? So they did try to help, but they stopped the offensive, of course, to bleed Warsaw out.
So we have two questions about the Soviet response, the Soviet assistance. So the first one is what is your opinion? Could the Red Army have reached the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944? You said they were the other side of the river, of course, Lena, but would it have been possible to actually get across and support with infantry and armor and artillery and actually take control? Then we have another one about where's the one from Andy there? Would a full-scale Soviet-supported airlift from day one have changed the outcome of the uprising? So basically, we're asking, could the Soviets have made a big difference?
Yes. I mean, that is Andy, by the way, I love you. Thank you very much for that one. Yes. Sorry, I've just jumped in and just taken over the whole thing. Yes, it would have helped. Any help would have
We
helped.
agree.
It would have made so much of a difference. And I think that God, I've just lost what I was going to say. But anyway, no, the other thing I was going to say is that I have this argument with military historians. No offense to any of the military. I know there's military historians in the chat. I'm not offending you, but I have constant chats with them going, well, you know, the Soviet army was so depleted and the Soviet army just couldn't refurbish and rearm itself to be able to get to Warsaw. And it's excuse after excuse after excuse after excuse when they could have been sending in air support, for example. They could have been marching towards Warsaw to fight the very few Germans that were left on the eastern bank. They could have made more of an effort. But I believe it's not a military issue, as everybody in this room will agree with me, is that it is a political reason, because the Poles needed to be put down. Because if they have a government ready to go, how are the Soviets going to be able to take it all over and do exactly what they did? And when they entered Warsaw on the 17th of January 1945, by the way, yes, in January, that's when they actually enter Warsaw, which is months after the end of the uprising. And they scream and shout, and I've had many arguments with tankies all over social media that we liberated Warsaw. Well, you liberated Warsaw when there was a couple of hundred people in it. I really don't think that's an actual liberation, is it?
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Absolutely. And there are two other examples that prove that, because Poles jointly with the Soviets liberated Vilna, right? The 1/4 of the losses inflicted on the Germans. So thousands of German troops were eliminated by the Home Army. And what happens then is, because the repetition of it mirrors the situation in Warsaw. So the officers get arrested and later murdered, and the average soldiers have a simple choice: either you march with us as soldiers of the First Polish Army, or Gulag. So, which, by the way, was the policy too by the under German occupation. So it's either when you got conscripted, you either could serve in Wehrmacht. If you refused, you were sent to Auschwitz, for example. So essentially, that also definitely surprised Polish underground government, because in Vilna it didn't happen, in Lvov it didn't happen. Lvov was also liberated by Poles, and then Russians arrived. So the cities were saved. Warsaw was not saved exactly because of what Alina said. What would Russians do later with the Polish government? They would have had to organize another Katyn massacre. It was better to wait Poles out, bleed Poles out in German hands, so as the Chinese saying goes, they would lend the knife to the Germans, and they did the job for them. Later they could say, well, we tried to help. What they really could do, it's a truth that they had massive losses, because they had hundreds of skirmishes on the right side of the river. It's a huge operation. The whole 9th German army got destroyed, and it's true that Germans had at least not full, but elements of 3 very good divisions, including 2 armored divisions and one paratrooper division. But in the end, they were all crushed, and the 9th Army ceased to exist. So at least what they could do is destroy the airfields, which they didn't do. The Germans were alarmed. They wanted to evacuate Okęcie Airport, which they used, by the way, as a base for Luftwaffe to bomb Warsaw out. But then they noticed, hey, let's hold on, let's stop. Russians are not doing anything. Why should we evacuate Okęcie? Nothing's happening. So they had massive advantage. They outnumbered Germans in the skies massively. They outnumbered them on the right bank of the river too. it was a political decision.
Well, just to let you know,
piggyback. Sorry, Woody, 2 seconds. I just want to
Yep.
piggyback off something Marcin said to do with Vilna, just to put this into perspective for people who are listening. So when they took, when the Soviets came into Vilna, it was about, I think it's a week or two of like, everybody was really happy. And then they did the mass arrests and mass executions and things like that. On VE Day, 1945, in Britain, if you look at the perspective, everybody's cheering, you've got those beautiful photographs, everything is really exciting and happy. There were thousands and 18,000 Poles in prison who are watching VE Day celebrations unfold. They're deported into the Gulag system. Poles, the last deportation of Poles to the Gulag system is in 1952. Right? 1952. By then, you've got Marilyn Monroe singing about her diamonds in the US. Poles are still being sent into gulags, forced labor, and not even half of them coming home. So just wanted to add that in there.
well, so thank you for that, Lena. So the sidebar is everyone's got different opinions about the Soviet response. We have some saying, great, the Soviets couldn't have done more. Jonathan Dimbleby in his latest book, Endgame, is saying there are lots of reasons why the Soviets couldn't help. But then Brad from OTZ military history says the Red Army could have done a lot more. So the opinion is divided on that. We do know, because Philip Blood talked about it 2 days ago, the river crossing that was mounted was disastrous. I mean, he talked about the ground there, incredible losses, but there were attacks in Normandy for the Allies that were disastrous. They did a better one later on to follow it up. You don't necessarily give up at the first time something goes wrong. So just playing devil's advocate there. I mean, yes, if the Soviets had done something, they would have had to have taken from somewhere else. And they're trying to do a lot in 1944, just kind of to give them a bit of credit there. But also, clearly, they could have done more in this situation. But that's a complicated one. Let's bring it back to something that's maybe a bit easier to answer. And I want to bring Alexandra in as well, because she hasn't spoken for a bit. So we had the one, and it is, how is it the uprising taught today in Polish schools? And has there been a change of how it's been taught since the end of communism? That's a really good question to bring it back onto that kind of legacy.
Yeah, since the beginning of the 1990s, the topic of the Warsaw Uprising is included in the Polish curriculum in Polish history lessons. So it's also interesting to say that during the times of communism, history teachers would risk their career and would tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising and of the Katyn massacre and all the events that were very important when it comes to World War II to their students. And so sometimes they were laid off, yes. So right now we have a very good coverage of the Warsaw Uprising in the Polish schools, and we are happy that, for example, our museum attracts the young people not only with the story of the uprising as it is taught when you come to the museum and you follow the narrative, but we try to organize different concerts, different workshops, different projects to attract their attention. We are trying to be active on Instagram and different social media because it's very difficult to attract the young people with history matters. Anyway, we need to work on that more and more.
I think we are catching up on the previous decades where Warsaw Uprising was so terribly denigrated, and the Home Army was, during the Stalinist time, the Home Army was seen as fascist collaborators, the traitors, whatever. When the more nationalistic fraction took over, the fraction of the Communist Party in 1956, Home Army became sort of second category heroes. The ones that were brave and fought against the German, the fascism at the time was the word. Again, they fought against fascism, but they were the irresponsible commanders were the servants of the imperialists, of the British or the Americans, especially the Polish government in exile. So that was the next version, I think this is why we concentrate on heroism of those people now, and the unparalleled, is true, incredible bravery of the people who sacrificed not only their lives, but frequently the lives of their families for the future generations of Poles, and for freedom. put it clearly, and also not only for freedom, but also for the message that some from the Polish government, Polish resistance government, thought would be reached in the West, and it wasn't, as we know, at the time when it was happening. However, I think in the future I hope we'll also focus on the more practical aspects on the because I believe youngsters should be taught also about the mistakes, about the strategic situation. It's true. We shouldn't sugarcoat the history of Warsaw Uprising. There were many strategic mistakes that were made. There were certain irresponsible tactical decisions as well, such as the double attack on the Gdańsk railway station that cost hundreds of people without heavy equipment, and so on. Also, the messages that the Polish resistance had from its own intelligence, saying General Irane Kosmecki, one of such people, he said, let's start the uprising. Russians are too far, Americans are too far. Our weapon supply is terrible, because remember that 1 out of 8 had a pistol, 1 out of 12 had a rifle, 1 grenade per head, and perhaps some Molotov cocktails. That was the average weapon supply amongst Poles. So this will be studied, and the debate about whether it had sense or didn't have sense, whether it made sense or didn't make sense. Of course, I'm not sure whether it makes sense to talk about the sense of the Warsaw Uprising, because we would have to judge the battle through the eyes of the people who lived back in the days, and that's the lesson that should be taught also to the youngsters. Before you judge, before you say it didn't make sense, that the Warsaw Uprising was destroyed, that's how daily situation looked like in Warsaw. Mass executions, roundups, torture, concentration camp, extermination camps, and the saviors from the other side of the river that the poet from the Warsaw Uprising put in the best possible way, better than any political analysis. We are waiting for you, the red disease, to save us from the Black Death. I think that's a good summary. That also that's kind of popular poem at Polish schools,
and was forbidden till 1989.
I mean, we're back to the point really of the fact that now you're just discussing. You've taken control of your own history and you're unraveling it, and you're in that stage now where it might get a little bit more complicated before you kind of make sense of it, because you're in a sense 40 years behind. In that we Brits, we were debating Operation Market Garden the week after it ended. You had 40 years where you really couldn't talk about it, and now you can. So you've got 40 years more to catch up and start, as you said there, Marcin, looking at the mistakes made and the errors of judgment and all the involvement of ultra and code breaking in all this, and the intelligence is a really massive one. But I want to bring it back to something, Alina, you said you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but I want to clarify things, because Andreas, one of our German viewers, is saying, did the Germans honor the agreement to treat the Home Army fighters as POWs? Because you wanted to make that distinction earlier about the fighters, the kind of people who are assisting the fighters, and the regular civilians. And you talked about so there are different classifications here. Do you kind of I know we've sort of taught it already, but you want to just kind of break it down for us one more time?
Very good question.
Sorry, funny enough, if I'd have seen that question earlier, I'd have pulled up the whole thing, because I've got it. Right. I've got the whole thing translated into English. Again, that will actually come up in the podcast where we talk closer towards the end of the Warsaw Uprising. But it's something that there are negotiations happening from early-ish September to say, we're going to give up, but we want our things honoured, and they don't honour it. And it takes such a long time. It takes weeks of arguing, going back and forth to be able to honour them as prisoners of war. Right. Women are also included in that. Women are actually honoured as female fighters and prisoners. That is a massive thing that happens in this, because women are usually excluded from all of this. Women are they're just, but there were women who did fight. And this is something we haven't brought up. And actually, Alexandra brought this up earlier, alluded to it earlier in the discussion, where, we don't talk about everybody, because she specifically mentioned children. We also don't talk about women. And women are such a key and important role, even though many of them didn't fight with a gun in their hand. They did so many other things in supportive roles. There were sappers, for example, this is incredible. I think Wanda Gertz,
paramedics, runners, yes.
Exactly.
absolutely.
Wanda Goddess is one of my favorite human beings. I love her. I wrote about her First World War career, and she basically imitated a soldier in the First World War. She hid she was a man, and everything she learned in the First World War, she passed it on to the women that she knew, and then she ran her own platoon, basically, of these incredible women who partook in the uprising, blowing things up and partaking in some of the most dangerous missions. These women are incredible, and that's what's the most important thing is, for me anyway, is that women finally got that status to be honoured as prisoners of war. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that, but there is a huge, long list, and Roger, Claire and I actually sit there and go through some of our most favourite points of that, of which obviously I don't have with me.
And
but
there were actual soldiers in Warsaw Uprising. 1/5 of the fighters were ladies, actually, so mostly paramedics, but not only. Also regularly, Alina mentioned the soldiers fighting with a gun in their hand. But I think Andreas, to answer the Andreas question, that came in stages, because the first month in August, which was very typical during the occupation, the Home Army soldiers were not recognized as soldiers, so they were treated as polnische Banditen, put up against the wall and then executed. And that wouldn't change actually until it started to change in September. There were exceptions, of course. So if you ran into, say, I don't know, Luftwaffe unit or certain Wehrmacht units, they could take prisoners earlier. But as a rule, even Wehrmacht didn't take insurgents as prisoners in August. Then Americans and British sent a warning to the German High Command: if you don't recognize these guys as our allies, we'll put your prisoners against the wall too. So that's why in September the situation improves, and the final capitulation, most of the fighters were recognized as soldiers. That was one of the conditions that Poles made. Okay, we're going to surrender, but the city is not going to be destroyed any further. The civilians are going to be treated okay, and we are going to be recognized as soldiers. So most of those who went to prisoner of war camps, they were hungry. Sometimes they worked as forced labor, as slaves. Some of them were beaten, but most of them would come back home actually. So that's the conditions in the POW camps were much better than in concentration camps.
Can you check that comment back up you had earlier about the civilians? Because I just want to touch on that.
If I can find it, but talk about it anyway, and I'll try and find it. Yeah.
Did it include civilians? No, it didn't. But what's a very interesting point is that throughout the whole uprising, civilians were given, even though they were being mass murdered, which is the most ironic thing in all of this. You know, you're still massacring the civilian population, for example, in the Wola and the Ochota massacres, and constant massacres that were just continuing around the whole of Warsaw. They're also being deported from Pruszków, which is in the south, where they were being deported. 50,000 were deported to concentration camps. We already mentioned this already about Auschwitz and other concentration camps. You have forced labor deportations. Basically, they were slowly evacuating the city. But throughout the whole uprising, they were given the opportunity to leave at the same time.
But you would never know where you would end up.
Then this is the thing. You don't know.
Yes.
Because when people ended up in Pruszków, the conditions there were so... We seem to think, oh, it was just a transit camp. The conditions there were horrible. They were horrific. There was no food. There was no water. There was no sanitary conditions. There was no hygiene. Nothing. These people were literally suffering from hunger, food.
And no humane treatment. Families were separated, yes. And we need to underline that more than 600,000 people were deported through the transit camp of Pruszków camp.
Possibly even more.
The unknown, yes.
And that's just a very good point to remind ourselves whenever we talk. I mean, this isn't really the Eastern Front, but it's more East than it is West. Is that when we talk about Normandy, where I live, with a few exceptions of some murders of the Canadians and Brits by the 12th SS, if you were captured in combat, you were taken back to the rear lines and you were fed and you were taken somewhere. You know, the cases of reprisals and atrocities are thankfully very small. This is a very different ballgame. And the further east you go, the more uncertain your fate is if you are taken prisoner. I'm using that word kind of loosely during an encounter with, particularly when we get things like the Derlewanga Brigade and all those kind of arseholes that are involved in this. So it adds another type of dimension to this, of that you're fighting in an army, but it's an army that is not treated necessarily under universally accepted terms. And of course, the same applies to the Japanese and prisoners of war out there as well. But I want to ask a couple of specific questions before we bring things in. So these should be quite quick ones. Graham is asking, was Rokossovsky for or against pushing on Warsaw during the uprising? Because of course he is Polish, depending on how you define nationality, but he's definitely got a camp in it. What do we know about Rokossovsky's opinion about this?
Can I just throw in one thing before we talk about him?
Yeah, please.
Woody, the basic thing you've just said is the same thing as we would say Erich von den Bach was also Polish.
Yeah, true.
Identity.
There's on both sides. Yeah, true.
Zalewski. Sorry, let's add the Polish name at the end.
Yeah.
He was fully Germanized, yes, but already before World War One. To what extent? Yes, Rokossovsky. To what extent his national feelings? Well, he was a loyal
Soviet officer.
Soviet, we may say, yes. Whether he felt truly Polish, Alexander, what do you think? I'm not really sure about this. He was more Soviet than Polish. Yes, it was a multinational empire. Yes, the Soviet Union. So whether the people that were Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish, they were serving the system. Whether he was in favor of pushing forward, that was up to Stalin, really. So we may talk about I'd say more about what General Berling would try to do, and no matter how much we criticize him, he brought 200,000 people after certain death. So whether he can be considered a Soviet servant or not, he actually formed the Polish army. So he would definitely prefer. I believe it was up to him. He would have helped. Whether Rokossovsky was in favor of that, Stalin was calling the shots, and that was all that mattered.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly.
Good point. So a technicality about the starting of the uprising. Ron is asking, did the Home Army start the uprising based on a Moscow radio message? Alexander Ritchie says no. US Ambassador Arthur Lane in I Saw Poland Betrayed says yes.
Oh, that's interesting. Let's see how our panelists go with this one. So for me, very quickly, I think there's many more factors than just the Moscow radio message. It's not just one. These are factors that were coming all the way through the whole of July, even in June. So was the uprising decided for that very reason of the Moscow radio? No.
Okay. It might have misled Poles into thinking that there was going to be some military assistance.
Okay.
But really, the military operation was to make the Soviets communicate with us. It was like a bargain token. Okay, we are doing an uprising, and we are. These are our authorities. You have to talk to us. We are not being just passive and waiting for your army to march into our territory. Also, message to the West. You have to do something about it, because this is a big event that cannot be ignored, which is total miscalculation, of course, because it's that wouldn't change. As the runner Jeziorański, the famous runner from London, the famous messenger would put it, that wouldn't even change the British policies by an inch, and they wouldn't change the policies by in Moscow either. I mean, it changed their policies because the Mikołajczyk went to talk to Stalin, and the moment he mentioned that the uprising was about to start, the Russians stopped the offensive. So this is one of the big mistakes. Actually, if Poles hadn't informed Stalin about the uprising, perhaps Russians would have crossed the river. So no, that wasn't. All in all, we may argue that in the end, and that's the most tragic aspect of it, the Warsaw Uprising turned out to be in the Soviet interest, because the Germans destroyed the city, and they destroyed the anti-communistic resistance. That's also, I believe, important point to say for those who watch us from France or from Italy, that 80% of the Polish resistance was also anti-communistic. So it's a completely different case than in France or in Italy. And of course, Stalin knew that perfectly. So no, Poles wouldn't rely on the Soviet incentive to start the uprising. We were not so misinformed that would be reliance on the external factor. Quite on the contrary, it was to demonstrate that Poles are in control of their own territory.
Okay, so thank you very much. I want to kind of start to wrap things up with the transformation. Okay, and I mean this in both physically, but also as a beacon of hope. You know, there is Warsaw at the end of this. I mean, when we talk in Normandy about some of the cities were destroyed, and they were very, very badly damaged. Warsaw was pretty much completely destroyed. I mean,
Obliterated.
Obliterated is a better word. So, and yet here we are, and I think, Alexander, you said this earlier on, and I want to bring it back to this, is that we are 80 years on. I want to talk about the messages that we can learn from this, because, for example, in Normandy, there's a museum to the British 6th Airborne Division at Pegasus Bridge. So when you're going there as a member of the public, you're talking about elite paratroopers who've trained to jump out of aircraft, who are fit young men, all in their early 20s, doing something that seems quite extraordinary. The Warsaw Uprising seems to be much more about people. And you're clear that children were not directly involved in the combat, but they are there peripherally in the environment. They're there. They're suffering the same way. So, and you've got and the male and female aspect you've all been talking about. They're side by side, different age groups working together. You've got captured weapons. You've got weapons that you've hidden yourself. That's a very good message to send out of unity and people today in a world where, people's rights are being lost across. We're not going to go into politics too much, but people are standing up on basic human rights principles. You have a really strong message there to send to the world. So to bring things to Alexandra, what do you have a single message that you think the world can learn from the Warsaw Uprising and what you're trying to do at the museum, for example?
Yeah, I would put that in one sentence. That is that hatred destroys anything that's material, but cannot destroy what lies in our hearts. That's what I keep saying at the very end of guided tour at the Warsaw Uprising Museum quite often. But I would like to underline that anytime I'm watching Lord of the Rings or Star Wars Rogue One, there are those powerful moments, for example, when Aragorn says that I give hope to people, I leave none to myself. Or there's this powerful scene in Rogue One when the main characters are about to die, but they passed on the message, and Leia will save the world, etc. So very often we talk to the visitors through the images of literature, of cinema, to make them understand that sometimes sacrifice is needed. Yes, sometimes there are some values worth fighting for. No one is questioning right now the right of let's say Ukrainians fighting for their freedom. Is freedom worth fighting for? Yes, it's always worth fighting for. Yes, and that's the key message of also the Warsaw Uprising.
Well, I liked you already, but now you mentioned Rogue One. You've just, you've gone to right at the top of my league table of favorite guests. I mean, for my money, the best Star Wars film, and it's a World War II film in a science fiction setting, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. But Marcin, again, with what you're doing in the Memory of Nations, you're involved in bringing communities together, bringing nations together. Do you have a similar reaction to what we can learn globally from the uprising?
I think it's quite a special thing what Poles fought for, and the universal message is, as Alexander put it, I couldn't put it any better. It's fighting for freedom, and in the wider context, it's fighting for all your kinsmen and all the future generations. I don't know if you would agree with me. It would be quite an English thing to fight for the monarch. Yes, I mean throughout the history. Yes, at least or for the monarchy, for the empire. So this is that quite different. That's the spirit of what you are fighting for. That differ. The Germans fought for the Führer, Ukrainians fought for the local Ukrainian insurgent army leaders. The Americans would fight also for the democracy and peace in the world, and so on. Here we fight for Poles fought first of all for the survival.
Yeah.
So from the beginning of the war, so it's clear that if Germans had won the war, there would be no Poland, there would be no Poles. So the plan was to exterminate most of the Polish people, which is also another factor. That's not the case when we speak about Warsaw Uprising, because it was known that Germans were about to lose the war anyway. But it was definitely to fight for the freedom of not only our freedom, but also future generations of Poles. So this is really sacrificing your life and sacrificing the lives of your family, because those people were fully aware that if they get caught and the information is extracted and Germans find out who these are, the whole families will end up in Auschwitz, for example, or elsewhere. And the really Poles are the heart between the rock and the hard place. You have to keep the hammer and the hard place. So this also is the universal message. You do whatever you're supposed to do. You're just doing your job, no matter what the conditions are. And the conditions were the most horrible, most hopeless in some cases, but still Poles did their best. They lost the battle, but the Warsaw Insurgents remained a role model for the future generation, including Solidarity. Solidarity members always mentioned that without this example of ultimate sacrifice, they also wouldn't get perhaps the proper drive to do what they were supposed to do with 10 million members that ultimately transformed Poland into a democratic country.
Wow, this is getting wonderfully deep but very uplifting now. Alina, again, you've got a foot in both camps, Poland, UK as well. And when we're talking about the Blitz in London and things like that, in Warsaw, the stakes couldn't have been higher. As Marcin said there, if you get caught, your family could be rounded up as well. Of course, bombs in the Blitz are indiscriminate as well, but soldiers storming the beaches of D-Day generally aren't worried about their wives and children. Mostly their wives and children are safe. Certainly if you're an American or Canadian. The British, yes, there's V1s and V2s landing, but to most extent, your family are safe. You can focus on keeping yourself safe and getting your job done. So, Alina, to kind of round things up, legacy of the Warsaw Uprising, legacy. Obviously, you've got a big investment with your granddad there, but to bring us home on this, what are your final thoughts?
I think the other two panelists really covered it.
They did leave you with not that much meat left on the plate, did they?
Well,
really?
sorry for that. No, you will surely come up with.
Yeah, it's fine. For me, I think we did get a chance in the Western world, so England and America. We did get that opportunity to talk about the Warsaw Uprising. I grew up just outside of the communist period, so I don't really remember it very well. But my dad would most likely agree with me here, is that they could talk about Poland. They did learn about Polish history. It was ingrained in us to be patriotic and to love our country. Polish is my first language, even though I have a charming British accent for the Americans. No
comment. You're like me. You sound common as muck.
Darling, I'm putting on the received pronunciation right now. No, I am common as muck, but I do try and speak correctly. But no, we had this opportunity. Poles like Marcin and Alexandra, they grew up here. I didn't. And they had to face a much harder time, even though they're still very young. We're all about the same age. But I had it completely different. At school, we were taught, and it was ingrained into us, Warsaw Uprising, Poland, we fought. Talk to your grandparents. My grandfather actually, to be honest, didn't really talk about it. He would dismiss me and say, oh, yeah, I was in the uprising. To find out what he actually did, I had to read about it. And then I went and asked him questions. And then he finally spilled the beans and told me more about it. So we had more of that freedom in the West. And I think that's another reason why Poles like me are far more patriotic than Poles in Poland. That's a whole other kettle of fish to cover. But I think I'm going to end with that one. Poles outside of Poland, and I know there's a couple in this group. I've seen them. I know who you are. I'm watching you all. Yes, we're far more patriotic. And
I cry at things in Britain, living in France, that I didn't do when I was there. A little bit of thing like a ceremony. I don't get all patriotic because I'm not living there. It's that weird living out of somewhere that you kind of you look at your nation differently. And Alan Allport, who has Brit living in America, has that same thing where you're kind of you're more patriotic, but you're also aware of your country's faults when you live outside of it. It's an interesting mix. But just to bring things, I know we said we were going to round things off, but we have a couple of questions asking about what Warsaw is like today. So Sir Capo said, how was Warsaw rebuilt? And Ian Carr said, do the panel consider the streetscape of central Warsaw as rebuilt well? And how long did it take to rebuild? So let's finish off with that.
Do you have an hour?
No, we don't have an hour. We've got 5 minutes.
I can add very quickly to this. If anybody would like to come to Warsaw and have a tour, I can show you all of this stuff. It's very interesting. So hit me up.
Okay, we'll do that. But generally, you know, Warsaw is there's lots of beautiful parts of Warsaw now. You've rebuilt yourselves pretty well, do you think, or is is there a consensus among you?
I would say
there's one good slogan, right, Alexandra, that explains Warsaw is not a city that was rebuilt; it was built afresh.
Built afresh.
Yeah.
Only the old town was actually rebuilt. The rest of the city looks completely different.
Revamped.
Okay.
Revamped. As we have a saying here, thanks to Hitler and Stalin, we have beautiful white streets and white squares. Yes.
I've got to tell you, one of my favorite spots in Warsaw is actually at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And if you stand back, you can see the whole landscape, meaning you have old, you have the ugly building, or as I refer to it as Stalin's penis, and then you have the new. And it's such a really interesting landscape where you see the 3 different levels of Poland. And I love it. I think that's it. That's the perfect image of Warsaw.
I would say
you touched on the subject of the Stalin's penis being brought down, or whether it should stay. Yes, ongoing debate in Warsaw.
No,
that's a massive one. We're not doing that one. We could do it, not today. We could do it. That brings up a whole lot of complication about the erasing of history and moving on from history and statues.
Yes. Never had the discussion.
But it's always best to leave the audience wanting more. I've really enjoyed this conversation, but we're at 90 minutes, which is, if we stop now, we'll get a chance of people watching us on catch up later on. It's been really fantastic listening to you, and I like the fact that you're engaged with this, and I feel you're kind of at the you're not finished with this, dealing with this. There's lots more to say, whereas perhaps some of the aspects from the Western understanding of World War II, we go, we've done that subject now. You've got a lot of years ahead of you to really get to grips with this, and I look forward to seeing what Polish scholarship and podcasts are going to be adding to our understanding of this as the years to come. So thank you everybody for joining us. I'm back again one more time before I have a week off. So tomorrow we get way off to the Worthington Force in Normandy with Mike Bechtold. But right now I'm going to thank my panelists. Thank everybody for the fantastic comments and questions in the sidebar. As always, you get a university degree education just reading your sidebar comments. Thank everybody. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much.